Alexander Graham Bell was experimenting with the idea of sending several telegraph messages over the same wire at the same time. He was using a set of spring steel reeds and working with the receiving set in one room. An assistant operated the sending set in the other room. Suddenly, the assistant Watson plucked a reed of steel to make that vibrate, and it produced a twanging sound. The very next day, the first telephone was made, and the voice sounds could be recognized over the first telephone line. This is the dramatic story of the invention of telephones that occurred on 2nd June 1875.
Telephony in Uganda should have started with a company called the East African Posts and Telecommunications Corporation. That was fixed telephone. Then in the 70s we had a breakup of the East African community, and in Uganda we ended up with Uganda Posts and Telecommunications Corporation, which was restructured into several companies in 1998. In 1995, in addition to the fixed telephony that was provided by Uganda Posts and Telecommunications Corporation, a new service started from Celltel Uganda, a mobile service. It was a very expensive service then. In 1998, the mobile service was enhanced with the introduction of, or the launch of services by MTN Uganda. And the rest is history.
In East Africa, the beginning of telecommunications network is directly linked to the spread and expansion of the British Empire. It was a colonial policy of global interconnection as part of a network of military and diplomatic telecommunications that then linked Britain, India and South Africa and stretched beyond the reach of the railway in an era of imperialism. In the time following the Industrial Revolution, the frontiers of the electric communications expanded rapidly, and this development was shaped by technological change. The railway and telegraph systems were therefore developed according to unfolding priorities of the time.
In Uganda, the telephone came in the colonial days in the early 1950s, and as has been said, the idea for telephony is to be able to communicate from one geographical point to another, tele-distance, that's why it's called telephone, to share information. And this is mainly one human to another in transferring that information. So obviously in governance terms, when the government needed to communicate, to transfer instructions, to transfer information to different points in the country, telephones were introduced to speed up that process, where a courier either driving there or somebody running there or something, this collapsed time in terms of information flow, and therefore created efficiencies in governance, in management during the colonial times.
When lines were laid into the interior of Africa to the south and north of Lake Victoria in the first years of the 20th century, they did not sprout capillary routes until much later, mainly because they were primarily tools in a grand scheme of colonial conquests. Distant and extreme regions in the territory, long-distance interconnections, and urban networks were, as a matter of priority, not cabled until the 1920s with the growth of government.
The technologies at the time required that for the telephone to be linked to another, there had to be a physical line. So you had telephone poles, you had physical lines, and This meant that you had to invest a lot in the infrastructure to be able to connect people. And this therefore restricted the growth, the wide growth of telephones in the country. But within the governance sectors and even the private sector in terms of social contact, people's homes and so on, the telephones were there, but very limited in number. But for the major government business, wherever there is a government office, there were telephones.
The medium of the telegraph was developed initially to complement the railway network, and both expanded as priorities in aiding long-distance systems that worked as a signaling arrangement, in affording the remote control of the colonies during the imperial era. On the basis of the new information capacity, and because the telegraph used only very small and intermittent electric currents, which could only be supplied from portable, cheap, reliable batteries, the telegraph came into worldwide use as a cheap and low-priced application. Although it remained a communication link easily laid along railway lines, it facilitated the coordination of shipping, capital and troop movements. The telegraph fostered the globalized control mechanisms that the world was developing at the time. The experience of telegraphs within the distant imperial territories had started in 1850 and proved efficiency as existing telegraphs helped save lives and money by giving early warnings in different abnormal instances. Communications facilitated and improved troop deployment, movement, and with swifter international communication and action, losses could be reduced in places where they were deployed.
Telecommunications was a national asset and therefore a government body. In Britain, you had British Telecoms. In the US, also all these, they were government owned. So it wasn't deliberate that government restricts it for itself, but maybe because of the infrastructure. And at the time, in colonial days, in developing countries like ours, maybe very few people could afford to have them terminate at their home, to bring the poles and the copper wire terminating at their homes. That's why it appeared as though it was restricted to government.
In the second half of the 20th century, when aspirations for independence gained momentum like a cyclone across the African continent, cables had been laid overland. However, they had constantly been at risk to subversive operations from time to time, undertaken by states that hosted the lines. Therefore, lines fell victim to the unreliable line management of the host countries, which in a way undermined the development of the system. The colonial government had proposed an undersea cable to guarantee security, together with greater reliability from less intermediate connections and the advantage of complete control that the colonial system would guarantee. From the onset of the Industrial Revolution through beginning of the 20th century, the imperial administrations in the domains dominated worldwide communications for the next 50 years, maintaining them as a space for the application of power until the coming on of the satellite as a carrier medium.
You see, the colonial system had to defend itself, had to manage itself and its institutions. So many of the things, education for example, security, were geared to defending the colonial administration, providing labor for the colonial administration and colonial setup.
In 1892, a violent power struggle in Uganda between indigenous factions threatened the evacuation of Imperial British East Africa Company and the missionaries from the territory. The situation revealed a discrepancy between administrative practices and communications delivery. Amidst a raging conflict that left many in the local community dead, plans for the abandonment of the area had been prepared between the Imperial British East Africa Company and the Foreign Office. Yet, there was a 3-month time lag between messages leaving Mengo in Kampala and reaching Britain through the caravan system. The situation, as precarious as it was, had been resolved, with military and diplomatic control re-established.
Telecommunication was a preserve for telephone, for example, for the top bureaucrats in the colonial system, and also was a preserve of the few business people who were essentially not local. Now, since then, there has been a resurgence of freedom, a resurgence of business, a resurgence of interaction with other countries, and among the big beneficiaries of this resurgence has been the ICT sector.
During the entire colonial era, Uganda was an essential part of British control of the Nile and completed an uninterrupted swathe of conquered territory extending from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Britain had secured it in the second half of the 19th century. The colonial power justified its mission as one of civilizing and driving economic enlightenment. This was consolidated by production and settlement in these areas of colonial subjugation. This phase was aided by electronic communications that offered continual and reliable access from rural areas to metropolitan centers and to Britain.
Telecommunications was to make sure that the governor communicated to the district commissioners. So it was to serve the establishment and the colonial system. More and more of our people are now liberated in a free and democratic Uganda, and I see this trend of expanding innovations and development of applications to be benefiting from a freer political and economic environment in our country.
The influx of settlers and administrators into the region to govern land and natives during the colonial period is noted to have developed complex structures that integrated government, economic and social administration. Until the telegraph and rail systems reached further inland from the coast, provisional communication systems continued to stand in for established remote means of native communication. Native runners were used to transport messages and mail parcels, where caravans safeguarded the transport of baggage and people. By the dawn of independence, there were 4 key systems of communication that existed side by side. One was the African communication systems, which were mostly local, but coexisted with the Arab-dominated caravan trading circuits that extended from the coast to the Rwenzori mountain.
At independence, there was really extremely limited communication. People depended on letters that would take weeks and months.
The European communication systems was based on a formal mail system that traveled by steamship, railway, runner or caravan. The fourth, which was exceptional, was the telegraph system, which used virtual transport systems. It negotiated distance in a new manner where human systems and procedures were not in tandem. It was the modern system emerging from the Industrial Revolution.
After independence, there was a need to bring in efficiencies in terms of not only transmitting information, but also processing information. And I think the government at the time, soon after independence, they felt that there was a growing civil service. There was a big civil service which was growing in Uganda after independence. so many districts, so many people being absorbed into the civil service. So it was growing. And things like payroll for the civil service could not be calculated manually. It would take a very long time. So the government at the time decided to invest in bringing in computers, and that's when the first computer came to Uganda, strictly to do government payroll.
The potential time for messages to reach their destinations in this area was reduced again and again by technological change that occurred over the period. Time and space were compressed. Runners and caravans were seemingly becoming redundant. But the system was far short of completion.
If you look back just in the last 10 years, a lot has changed in the communications industry. You do recall, like about 1997, we had only one monopoly operator, Uganda Post and Telecommunications Corporation. The younger ones perhaps won't even remember it, but then we had only one provider of services. Now we've opened up and enabled competition to flourish in the sector. So we now have many players providing a variety of services. Before we used to have traditional services just like fixed telephones, but now we have fixed telephones, we have mobile telephone services, we have several value-added services. So a number of players have come in, and because there is healthy competition thriving, they are now providing value services at affordable prices to consumers. In addition, we have now about over 90% population coverage of communication services in the country. You will find that almost everywhere in Uganda now there is communication services, but that resulted from an enabling policy that made it possible for operators to develop their infrastructure and extend their infrastructure to various parts of the country. I would say over 90%, well, perhaps if you're looking at geographical coverage, about over 65%, because there are certain areas like with the lakes and so forth, which are not adequately covered. But over 90% of the population is also already covered.
There's been a convergence in terms of delivering content to different formats. And it has been now fashionable to deliver content using the ICTs.